Sweet. Happy Friday, everybody. Hope your week has been well. Thank you for joining us again. We've been with you all week long, and I know that you're not anywhere near tired of us yet. Right, Steve?
I'm not tired of us, no.
Okay.
I'm tired of myself sometimes.
That makes one of us.
Every day on Sequitur.
Today we are going to be discussing the flood, and I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation. We have two people that are coming at it from different angles that you might be expecting. Joining us is Robert Rowe, a.k.a. General Han Solo from Sentinel Apologetics. And then again, we have Dr. Joshua Bowen from Digital Hammurabi. How's the channel going?
Yeah, really well. Everybody's making it work.
Excellent. I'm going to get some announcements out of the way, and then I've got something that I need to handle, and then we'll get into the discussion. But I'll keep them as brief as I can. Tomorrow we have tomorrow's Saturday. Sunday we have one of our deconverted stories, kind of like we did last Sunday with the Jehovah's Witnesses. This one's going to be on Mormonism, and we have a gentleman by the name of the Naked Mormon coming to join us. And then on Monday we have the the Legion of Atheists versus the Jesus League with our Infinity Question War. With our video that we released a couple of weeks ago, we've gotten several responses back from people to those questions. And there were several people on Twitter that kind of collaborated and put together a paper in response to that. So they're going to be joining us. Most of the people that you saw in that video will be here. Not all of them, but I'm not sure how that's going to work out logistically yet, because that's going to be a big room, but we're going to work it out and try to get a conversation going about those questions. And then on Tuesday, we have a discussion about censorship, and that's going to be with Bunty King. He will be joining us at 8 o'clock that next day. You can follow us on Twitter or in the live chat or on Facebook or the Discord to leave your questions if you have any for the end of the show. We'll try to get as many of those as we can in. On Twitter and Facebook, that's NonSec Show, NonSeq Show.com. And, okay, now, we all in this room, I think, can say that probably one of the highlights of being a content creator is when you get fan mail, or you get a comment that makes you feel really good and kind of keeps you motivated, right? I mean, we're all content creators. We all got channels here. That feels good, doesn't it?
Love them all.
Well, today I got one that I just thought that it was so good I needed to share it. So bear with me. It's not really lengthy, but just bear with me. It says, by the way, this is from Rourke Douglas Decker. It says, I really love the concept and format of this show, but unfortunately, it has a glaring weakness that has become obvious with every passing episode. That weakness is Kyle. I get that Kyle is trying to play the everyman foil to Steve's suave intellectuality and gracious skepticism, but in order to do that, he has to be able to bring something else to the table. Preferably a sharp wit and well-honed sense of comedic timing. And he just doesn't. Far more problematic is that Kyle is just not very knowledgeable or informed in the realm of science, religion, and philosophy. It's not that he lacks an expert's depth of knowledge, feel for nuance, and foundational framework for formulating an argument. It's that he lacks even a layman's grasp of the basic issues and the vocabulary required to discuss them. His statements are therefore marred by bad impression and too often outright misinformed. For example, he claims to have formerly been an evangelical Christian, yet his mischaracterizations of biblical concepts sound like the meanderings of someone who has never even opened a Bible, much less a biblical commentary. I've tried to be patient with him, thinking that this practice would get his sea legs under him, but this episode was arguably one of his worst. Next to Stephen the guest, many of whom are accomplished and well-educated, Kyle comes across as an uncultured hick. The host of the show doesn't have to know everything. He doesn't even have to know that much at all, but he does have to be able to hold his own. He can't rely on his co-host and guests to supply all of the material. If nothing else, he needs to be able to follow along the conversation. Otherwise, he just sounds like he's out of his depth. Way, way out of his depth. So, I just wanted to tell Rourke that out of all of that, the one takeaway is that at least I'm consistent. And I was sharing this with Steve earlier, and Steve said, Rourke, it's kind of an odd name. It just sounds like you would be a dick. But anyway, me and Steve looked up what Rourke meant. And according to Google, Rourke is someone who constantly messes up, ruins things, spills bong water, can't pop a boner, and doesn't know where to stick it. So, Rourke, I may be an uncultured hick, but at least I know where to stick it. Okay.
I didn't know. He said Rourke, and I said, what's a Rourke? I don't know what that word means.
Yeah.
So I don't mind looking something up if I don't know what it means.
I felt like it would be only right to broadcast his concerns to the greater public and give him my promise that I probably won't be changing a thing. But thank you, Rourke. Thank you very much.
And Kyle pinned that comment, by the way.
I did. I love comments like that. I eat it up. So now we're going to move over to Steve, who is going to introduce the subject for tonight. None of which I'll be able to follow along, but I'll just sit here and look pretty.
Kyle's going to go do something else for the next 2 hours. But before I actually introduce, I do want to add something to the Avenger thing. By the way, all the people that did write to us and give us responses to that video, I want to thank them all. Some of them were much better than others. We're going to be addressing as many of them as we can, but I do want to thank everyone, whether you had a crap response or not, that did respond, because we do appreciate that. And we will address as many as we can, right, Kyle? I think. I mean,
yeah, and shout out to Brass for his.
Brass was I will tell you right now, I thought Brass's was the best. So Brass, if you're listening
Absolutely.
to this, dude, props. Like I said, I may not agree with a lot of your answers, but I do think by far you took the time to really try to answer them, and your video was really amazing. I mean, I thought you did
the creativity in that was outstanding.
That was far beyond anybody else's. So Brass, props to you. But for the night, we're going to be talking about a really kind of interesting topic, because we all kind of agree that the Bible talks about a flood. I don't think anybody even thinks that's controversial. The Bible talks about a flood. But does the Bible talk about a global flood, or does it talk about a local flood? Right? And if you have to really dive into it, we have two people here that have taken the time to dive into it. We have Dr. Joshua Bowen, who's an expert in Assyriologist. He believes that the flood that's spoken about in the Bible was actually a global flood. However, he doesn't believe that it actually happened. So let's get that clear. He doesn't actually believe there was a global flood, but that the Bible talks about it being a global. And then Robert takes the position that the flood was a local, from just either rivers and Mesopotamian area. But anyways, introduce yourself, guys. I know, Dr. Bowen, you've been here before, and we love your channel, Digital Hammurabi, even though you have like one video on it. But that's gonna get more soon, I have a think. So will you introduce yourself again? People don't know, and then kind of tell us about your position on this, so you can kind of tell people where you're coming from on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Joshua Bowen. Actually, I think we've got maybe 15 videos up now. We've
I was getting ready to say, yeah,
we've been.
I've been there a while. Okay,
you
know what? I'm subscribed, but I'm not getting notifications. So that could be a YouTube thing.
Yeah, Megan's been really pushing hard on it. We try to.
Is this the last couple of days?
No, last 2 weeks. Yeah,
I haven't got a single notification.
One every day.
Yeah, that's
Mea culpa. Mea culpa.
But
now who can't follow along?
Yeah, I can't. I know. I'm gonna get a letter from work next.
Oh gosh, I better be careful what I say, or I guess don't say. I suppose. So I have a background in the ancient Near East. I have a PhD in Assyriology. I study Sumerian and Akkadian. But I also have a master's in theology. So I minored in Hebrew Bible at Hopkins in my PhD. So I've probably got 13 years of formal training in Hebrew, 6 in Greek, and I've studied Aramaic and a little bit of Ugaritic. Hopefully my Ugaritic professor isn't watching this. I'm really sorry, Dr. Lewis. I didn't do as well in that class as I would have liked. I had a lot of other things going on. But anyway, there are other people that do Ugaritic a lot better than I do, so we don't need me to do it. But I guess what I would say is, I've watched Han Solo's or Rob, I don't know what you.
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Tell me about, yeah.
Okay. I don't. So I've watched. You had a 2-hour presentation that you put up online. I watched or looked at the updated slides. You've done several other videos. I've watched them. I mean, clearly a lot of work has gone into it, and you clearly know an awful lot. It's great. It's great to see somebody very knowledgeable. I guess I take an opposing viewpoint in some of the things that you say, and that's okay. And it might be better. I mean, I would say that the flood, in its entire ancient Near Eastern motif, not just in the biblical text, but in the Akkadian text and the Sumerian as well, that it was. I don't want to call it a global flood because that's not. The idea of a globe isn't really what is appropriate there. I would say it's a worldwide, all-encompassing flood that wiped out the entirety of the human race, and that's what it was designed to do, along with all the animals and everything with it. So that's my position, and of course, Rob's going to talk about his, and we'll kind of talk about the evidence, and I think it'll be good talk.
Absolutely. So, Robert, your position on it, I know you've looked into this topic from your perspective. I mean, so why don't you kind of explain to people why you think that it was a local flood, according to the text, that did actually happen?
So what I want to do is try and join Genesis 6 to 9 with the rest of the Genesis passage, basically what scholars call primeval history, from Genesis 1 to 11. And usually when I see or when I read young earth creationist literature on the flood, it's very ambiguous as to where Noah is located, because in their model, it's the whole globe is being flooded. And so therefore there's no highlight as to, where the Garden of Eden is located, where Noah would be located. And not only that, but overlaps with ancient Near Eastern material on that. So in my presentation, in a nutshell, I went through a chronological approach from the creation account, showcasing that the creation account does, in fact, speak about the fixity of the land masses. And then elsewhere in the Old Testament, there's precedence on the fact that the ocean waters will not go over the land masses. There's a boundary now that's set. And therefore leading into where Noah, the character Noah, I highlight that out of Africa, humans migrate into the Persian Gulf region. Genesis 2 mentions 4 rivers, and those 4 rivers, as of 2010, have been completely identified. And interestingly, that's, the whole Eden scenario in Sumer, in that region over there, that actually makes sense in light of not just the Genesis account, but other ancient Near Eastern material. And so therefore, I've been reading other literature on the peculiar episode in Genesis 6, 1-4, which, your studies, I think you would be familiar with the Apkalu episode and so on. And so then that, going back to a very ancient memory, and as a Christian, I go by the peculiar interpretation of that passage, that it's more of a supernatural engagement than, say, divinized kings or something. And yes, what I do is I concord all this material from the literature and then see if there's any scientific precedence for it. And then that's when I came across a 2015 paper, which before 2015, I would not have been able to make that connection. This is all like Lego pieces that I was building as I was researching this topic for like 5-6 years. And then so 2015, a paper was released that there was a sudden deluge in that exact region where Eden would be located. And interestingly, the extension of the way the waters would flow and the directions and so on will then put the ark where Mount Judy would be located. And again, that correlates with ancient Near Eastern material. Like For example, Genesis 8 says that the ark lands on the mountains of Ararat, but the Dead Sea Scrolls and a lot of ancient literature will say it's Urartu. And am I pronouncing that right? Is Urartu the?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then, I did in my lecture, I then tackled the issue of the global language, which I know scholars like John Walton will say, oh, that's hyperbole and so on, and he'll give other connections with, for example, ziggurats in the ancient Near East have very hyperbolic language before they're constructed. So they've given measurements that are very like hyperbolic, and other judgments in the Old Testament like Sodom and Gomorrah and so on. There's all this like hyperbolic language. But I think, in a nutshell, I think that's ultimately my model for the flood. And
I think there's going to be two ways to approach it, Robert. So we give some time to Dr. Bowen here. I think there's two ways to approach it. Now, you guys can either approach it from the text, the textual criticism from the text, or from science. Do we have any history of there being a flood there? I don't know how you. It seems you want to approach it from the science. He wants to approach it from the actual literature. So why don't we start at one place, like maybe the literature?
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So. I don't have a scientific background at all. So, your presentation was fascinating to me, with the flooding of the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf region. That was all really cool. There are a couple things that I see. There's a hermeneutical, I think, difference in the way that we come to the text. So, I come to the text, even when I was an evangelical, I'm coming to the text, looking at it as an ancient Near Eastern text, and in the same way that I wouldn't ask a poetic text if it's true or not. I wouldn't ask that question about it. It's the same sort of thing with Genesis. This is a cosmological genre. It's very common in the ancient Near East. Yep. So, when I was listening to your presentation, the thing that stuck out is so much of your case is built on the Hebrew, right? And for example, you refer an awful lot to Psalm 104, this Kol Haaretz language. You talk about Yom in Genesis 1. And maybe, so I guess what I thought about tonight, maybe if we talk about those arguments, or those grammatical issues, syntactical issues, it seems like that if those don't stand, I think that it's problematic maybe for this interpretation of Genesis. Mm-hmm. So I thought that might be a good way to go about this, if you want.
No, I'm fine with that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So which part of Kol? So I was pronouncing Kol Haaretz, but I think because you're putting the definite article there, right? Kol Haaretz, yeah.
Kol Haaretz, yeah.
So yeah. Where did I go wrong with that? Did I go right in any of it, or did I go wrong completely?
Yeah.
Or?
So here's what I'm picking up. It seems like what you're saying, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is that they only knew about their finite region, right? And so Kol Haaretz only refers then to that finite region. So, the ancient Near East and, maybe just outside. So if you were to look at something like the Babylonian map of the world, you would say, yeah, this is what they're talking about. Kol Haaretz is this region that they lived in and that they knew about. They didn't know about people over in the Americas or, Australia or anything like that, mm-hmm. Which I would agree with. I mean, there's no question about that. But it seems like you then say that God had this like secret idea or hidden idea, that the language was just subtle enough or just ambiguous enough that a reader today could look at it and say, oh, all the land just meant that. The problem with it is that the use of that phrase, Kol Haaretz, doesn't just occur in Genesis, right? It's used, for example, throughout the Psalms. Sorry, my family just got back. You'll probably hear them in the background.
That's no problem.
Yeah.
But it's used throughout the Psalms, and it speaks directly to Yahweh's power and his glory being over Kol Haaretz. So like Psalm 47:2, he's the great king over all the earth. 47:7, he's king over all the earth. 83:18, he's the most high over Kol Haaretz. 97:5, the mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. So, I mean, if we're going to make the argument that Kol Haaretz there doesn't mean the entirety of the world, we have to then restrict Yahweh's power, in their opinion, to this localized region. And I don't think we'd want to. I don't think that would work theologically for your position.
But is that an exhaustive sample of Kol Haaretz that mean whether they know completely the extensive geography of their location, or as in the sense like you and I, we know extensively that it's the whole planet, we can go out and see the whole planet, whereas from their context, all this region that they know about within their vicinity, because there are instances where Kol Haaretz are used, like the Pishon River, it mentions that, the Gihon, then you have Joseph in Egypt, you have, I think it's also in Leviticus and Judges in a few places where, you know, if you'd then translate it like that, or interpret the phrase like that, then
yeah, I mean,
in
but
fact,
this is,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Oh, yeah, but this is.
I was thinking of one more, which would be, I think it's in Samuel, where Kol Haaretz should be curiously translated as people, not even land, like a localized group of people has in the Hebrew sense. The Hebrew has Kol Haaretz there, but translators will translate that to mean a people group in that vicinity.
But I mean, I guess that's the point, right? Is the interpretive fallacy that if it means it here, it means it everywhere, and that's problematic. So what has to determine what? So you have to do two things. For example, with Kol Haaretz, you have to say, okay, what can it mean? And we've just pointed out two things that it can mean, right? Well, three. So it can mean a people group, it can mean a localized region, and it can mean all of what they knew as the world, right? Mm-hmm. So then if those things are possibilities, it's only contextually, the meaning is only contextually driven. So then you have to go to the context and you have to look at other indicators to say, all right, what's meant here? Mm-hmm. So when you have other language like everything under heaven, I'm going to destroy all of humanity, from every man to every beast. Those are, other contextual clues, I think, that tell the interpreter this is in their opinion. They're telling a story about a flood that destroyed the entirety of their world, of the world, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess the other thing that I would say is that, if right now, I was just reading some of Sitchin's book because some of my listeners.
Zachariah Sitchin.
Yeah, Zachariah Sitchin.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Wait. Are you a fan of Sitchin?
No,
okay.
Not in the
That kind of
right up my alley.
A lot of my listeners.
Yeah, Kyle likes Sitchin, I think. I don't know, but
I do. Yeah, I do.
You really do. Okay.
A lot of our listeners are asking questions about it. They want us to do a video on it, so I have to read it first. So.
Could you do one on Velikovsky then, as well?
Yes.
Please.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm so excited for that.
I know this is we're off topic.
Exciting.
Sorry, guys, but I'm thrilled by this because I read Rules and Collision in high school, and I was like, this is legit. Even though I think Velikovsky at the time probably did have something to say, but I think he was kind of like, maligned. But yeah. Sorry.
When's that episode come out?
On the channel, I don't get notifications for it.
all you need to go on is zitchiniswrong.com. That's it.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Take care of it. But if right now, the only reason I bring that up is because I'm getting ready to talk about the solar system. But like right now, this is obviously impossible. But if we knew about 8 planets or 9 planets, whatever Pluto is, and then for some reason, 100 years from now, somebody found out that there were 10 planets, right? If I made the comment today that the sun shines on all of our solar system, right? that person 200 years from now that finds out that there's another planet couldn't make the argument that, well, the sun doesn't shine on that 10th planet because Josh said all the solar system and all he knew about were those 9 planets, right? So it can't shine on the 10th. And I guess in the same sense, you have to pick one or the other, I guess. And that's what I hear in that this argument requires that they said it was the entire world. The text says it was the entire world, but we know that it was just their entire world. And if that's the case, then you have to then say that God had this mysterious secret purpose. And if you're going to say that, I think then you have to have significant evidence from the text to line up with that and to support it. I've talked a lot. Sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, what you share is interesting. So what I'm in response, what I'm thinking is, I think when you use the word context, I think that is, context is king. That is usually the phrase that you hear in university and all that. So that being said, is it true that the sun, shines its light everywhere? Yes, it's true. And at the same time, when we look at the sun, when we look at the solar system, it's not just across a horizontal plane, it's everywhere, 360 degrees all around. That's the context of the solar system. But then I'm thinking, okay, if I look at Genesis 6 to 9, and I just isolate that away from the supposed appearance of history, of humanity, the geography, and so on, that exists prior to Genesis 6, and I just see it as this mythical story of here's what happened before. There's these angelic things going on and intermingling, and then Noah finds favor with God, and then builds an ark, and then bam, just this whole. We don't even know what we don't even have a description of what the earth looks like or what the environment looks like. It's just this rebellion takes place. Noah finds favor with God. I'm going to wipe out specific species and so on. Build an ark. The flood comes. And then the one time a particular, I guess you could say in a context sense, a particular geographical detail is given is with the resting of the ark, where on the mountains of Ararat. So then, why can't I take into account the transition from Genesis 1, the locality of where Eden would be in my model, where humans are located, and I'm aligning this with actual anthropological research, which at the end of the day you and I can't disagree with, because this is if I'm arguing it's in history, then I have to include that in, and then I'm blending it in that context. And so therefore, as John Walton would say, when we put all that together, ultimately this would be hyperbolic, but at the same time localized. So how would you wrestle with that then?
Yeah, I mean,
if you're just going to narrow it down to Kol Haaretz.
Well, certainly not. It's just that seems to be sort of a linchpin in your argument. I suppose what I would say is I don't think this is what the text is doing, right? So the questions that we're asking of Genesis 1, we could also ask of what Marduk does with Tiamat's body and, creating the Tigris and the Euphrates from her eye sockets. Because it mentions very clear geographical features. So what I would say, sorry.
No, but are you? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
With that though, you're referring to the T-home of Genesis 1-2. The depths, the darkness, the spirit that's hovering over the waters. With Tiamat and so on. Is that what you're connecting that one to?
No, what I'm saying is that.
I understand what you meant by that,
yeah.
But I'm wondering if you're kind of importing that with the Genesis narrative, like there's a borrowing there. Yeah.
Well, certainly. I don't think there's any question at all that the Genesis particularly the flood story, but there's obvious connections with the creation account to other ancient Near Eastern literature. But I think my bigger point here is that it seems like we're taking the biblical text and affording it this this prominent place, and then because we afford it this prominent place, and we have this data from this historical data you referred to, well, then the biblical text has to be right. So then, how do we interpret almost ad hoc, the Genesis story, for example, Genesis 1, and so you come up with, for example, what you argue about. Each day being an epoch. Unfortunately, for the argument, I mean, the day there is a 24-hour day. I mean, from the Hebrew standpoint, I mean, linguistically, it's a 24-hour day.
What about Gleason Archer's argument then, that if there's no definite article before the word yom, then it would be a form of a poetic prose, and therefore...
I mean, I would argue that he's wrong. So,
Okay.
Yom Echad, that same phrase that's used, is used in Genesis 27:45. Why should I lose both of you in one day, Yom Echad? It's very definitely one day. Genesis 33:13. If they, being the cattle, are driven hard one day, Yom Echad, all the flock will die. Numbers 11:19. You will not eat it for just one day, Yom Echad, 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, or 20 days, but for a whole month. And these are clearly days. Jonah 3:4. Jonah began going Yom Echad, a journey, Yom Echad, a 1 day's journey into the city, and he cried 40 more days, and the city will be overthrown. So, I mean, I understand that there's some interesting, nuance when you have Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi. So you seem to have this odd-looking thing, but with Yom Echad, because you would expect it to be Yom Rishon, maybe. But because it looks odd doesn't mean that it doesn't mean a day. I mean, these are examples where it clearly does. I mean, there's no way around it. And when
all those, because I know all those references you mentioned, and I remember Michael Heiser giving a humorous touch on the Genesis 33 one, where the cattle or the sheep are driven for 1 day, and then he was debating a young earth creationist, and he goes, are you telling me that by your application that it's 24 hours? He's telling a younger creationist that therefore the cattle were literally driven for 24 hours. It makes no sense to then look at that as speaking of exactly 24 hours, but basically it means daytime or day, because yom is the only word that they had for time that progresses through. And that's from a book, an ancient Near Eastern book I was reading on, that's titled Space and Time in the Ancient Near East by Nicholas Wyatt. Interestingly, in other ancient Near Eastern material, you have time given, like you have the creation being given. This thing took so many periods, like so many years, and some of them have, like, interestingly, some of them have millions of years mentioned. But yet, the Genesis account is.
Can you tell me what you're referencing?
It's in his book Space, Time, and Near East, Nicholas Watt. I'll have to go and get the, and I'll give you the reference links on that. But
I guess what I'd want to see. So again, if we're talking about the meaning of Hebrew phrases syntactically and lexically, and if we're getting at that meaning utilizing the context, I really would want to see some passages where yom is used in this epoch sense, when it's not attached to something like the day of the Lord, where you have some type of a modification. And the
like Hosea 6, like Israel, 2-3 days, and yet we're talking thousands of years with the nation. Remember in Hosea 6, that's mentioned. So the way yom is used there, maybe you can look that up.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up now.
And to the moderators, like, I guess what what do you both want us to then dive into, or do you just want this to be a free flowing conversation? I don't mind.
I think it's going fantastic as it is.
Okay.
I mean, the back and forth is interesting. If you get up to a part where you're talking past each other or stuck, we'll jump in. But right now, it's fascinating.
Let me. I think maybe this is a good time to actually just jump into this and kind of throw this out, because you're talking about Genesis 6. So could we move on to like Genesis 7, 18 to 24? Could you guys want to talk about that a little bit? Because from what I'm reading of it, it does seem to imply the Earth as a whole, like a global thing. So where do you guys stand on that? If it's literally saying the Earth, you're arguing, Robert, that the Earth means just their area, sphere of influence in society, and he's obviously taking a different approach. So what do you guys think of Genesis 7, 18 to 24?
Yeah, so I take it as I just take it as this is the region by which the floodwaters take over, and that's another thing in my lecture. I referred to Second Temple texts like the Book of Enoch that actually see this as an enclosed, vast region, and even then it interprets the type of species that perish would be your typical farm animals and so on, which are not like you won't see, emperor penguins and polar bears and dinosaurs included in that. You have a specific narrowed down list that will then be associated with that region. Except the Book of Job also highlights on that, because Job's within that same vicinity. So, but I understand what Joshua's getting at, and that is, and I don't deny what Joshua's getting at, because this is where, interpretive issues arise if you need to be faithful to those interpretive issues. So I understand that he's telling me that, he thinks, and I don't mind that he thinks this, that I might be force-fitting, like, for example, when Pishon River is mentioned as Kol-Aretz, that therefore I import that to, that phrase Kol-Aretz to mean only local. And so what I'm trying to do is wrestle with the Genesis 6 to 9 as a whole in light of Genesis 1 to 5 and then 10 to 11. I mean, that the whole primeval history is localized. Yeah.
I mean, I would say that if you look at it from a different perspective, if you think about the initial creation motif that's used in Genesis 1, where you have this primordial water, and the rakia, the hammered out dome, whatever we want to call it, is slid essentially in and pulls water up, right? Mm-hmm. And then land comes up and the water runs down and goes underneath. And you have this picture, this, Rob, as you've talked about before, this ancient Near Eastern idea that you have this
which dome. I don't deny, by the way.
Yeah,
because I'm saying the text appeals to both.
Yeah,
like modern yeah.
But what I would say is that in the flood account, so these are literary texts, and particularly keeping with their ancient Near Eastern motif. So when you have the flood account and the lattice work of heaven is opened, and the springs of the great deep, bring the waters from underneath, and you have that primordial water coming back. It's God saying it's a do-over, right? I mean, this is the point. And so if you think about Atrahasis, or you think about the Gilgamesh Tablet 11 or something, and you think about how mad Enlil gets when he finds out that Utanapishtim, Atrahasis, whatever, has survived. It's the reason that he's so mad is all the humans are supposed to be dead, right? So the story, whether they got the geography right, whether they got that there's a globe, and I would argue that there's no idea of a globe in the biblical text, but
yet in those texts, where does the ark land?
Mount Nemush in But I don't know that that's.
So why not mention some place else? why is it so localized that then with science I can actually make the connection? I mean, if this was purely fiction, there would be absolutely no connection being made anthropologically and scientifically.
I mean, I don't know that that's true. And the other thing that I guess that I would say, and maybe this is something we can talk about, this idea that Genesis 1 represents an initial creation of humans in general, and not, the original pair, and then Genesis 2 then is the creation of Adam and Eve. I mean, I think that is that's a very forced. I think it's a very forced reading on the text, particularly because, again, from the literary standpoint, when Yahweh creates in Genesis 1, and he says, "I've created Ha'adam." In Genesis 6, he says, "I'm going to destroy Ha'adam." Right? I mean, this is the point. Yep. So I don't see, other than just making the assertion, because we know from an evolutionary standpoint that humanity has developed, and I'm getting out of my field here with evolution, sorry, but that humanity has developed and over these hundreds of thousands of years or whatever it is, sorry, that, well, if we have creation in Genesis 1 and creation in Genesis 2 referring to the same incident,
but that again, it comes down to the Toldot formula. Like, are we, in Genesis 2:4, there are scholars that say no, it's a sequel because Genesis 1 ends in Genesis 2:3,
and they have to, right? I mean, if you're looking at the text as a seamless narrative without this editing together, my old professor, Dr. Beale, would have argued from this perspective.
Oh, Gregory Beale?
No, Todd Beale.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But
I nearly got excited though. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think I just think there's so many pieces. When I listen to your argument, I think Occam's razor, because essentially it seems what it boils down to is you have to read into the text this special idea that God said everything possible to make it seem like the entirety of the world was destroyed, but yet left this notion just for us so that we could look back and say, well, actually, it doesn't mean that. And I still don't think you can do it with the Hebrew.
How would you then wrestle with texts like I bring up examples? Okay, like for example in Genesis 7, because Steve was like, let's, because I'm thinking Genesis 6. I'm still thinking of, say, Genesis, the pericope, the verses 1-4, the Apkallu Nephilim episode, which has a very ancient memory. I'm interested to hear your opinion on what that is. And then in Genesis 7, when it mentions all the sky, which that same phrase appears only 2 more times in Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 32, that all the objects in the night sky that represent the gods, that each nation that Yahweh disinherits, except for Israel, he puts them under the subjugation of these other gods. But I mean, when he's in Deuteronomy, when you read, "Don't look up at all the array of the night sky," does that mean that the Mesopotamian counterparts to Israel are everywhere around the earth, looking up in all directions to the night sky, or again, is it a localized thing and it's hyperbolic language?
Yeah, I mean,
because the whole 70 nations in Genesis 10 and stuff like that. That's all localized.
I mean, I think you when you read an ancient text, you can't read it through 21st century eyes. I mean, you just can't. So this idea that wrestling with, I guess I don't wrestle with how do we connect the fact of a globe and the fact of evolution with Genesis, because people used to ask me when sorry, my 5-year-old's crying. Oh,
It's okay.
I made.
Hi. Sorry.
I sing to Piper every night. I play the guitar and we sing.
That's good.
Long December by the Counting Crows. I don't know why, but that's our.
Could you guys get any more perfect? I mean, for real.
But people used to ask me, so do you believe in evolution? When they hear that I was a pastor, right, or that I studied ancient Near Eastern texts. And I would always pause and say, are you asking me because of Genesis, right? Because I don't think those two things are related, right? I don't think you go to Genesis and try to make evolution fit, because that's not what the text is doing. I mean, I think Genesis is written as a direct reaction to, these Babylonian and Assyrian assertions that were, obviously very common at the time, that Marduk or Asher or, any of the other gods, but particularly those two, were the ones that were responsible for the creation of the world. And, the writer, if it did happen in the Babylonian captivity, is saying, no, Yahweh did it. And so if that's what the text is doing, then I don't think I have to worry about things like, can I make the globe fit in here? Because all I have to do is leave it in their setting. What is it that they would have seen? So when they say all the
I'm not fitting the globe in. All I'm doing is I'm looking at this text. As of the 1900s, only I suppose since the 1900s, you have this influx of ancient Near Eastern studies that then we need to take seriously. And yet at the same time, you have from the 1600s interpretations of the text as speaking of natural history. So John Sailhammer is one scholar. Then you have Lisa Narcher. Then you have John Walton, interestingly, actually recently, I guess you could say, recanted on the rakia, because now they're finding that rakia could be the volume within that metal, hammering, not the actual hammer surface itself. And so, little things like that I'm noticing in the literature, but which, by the way, I wasn't always a Christian. I became a Christian at the age of 21 in 2009. So I've only been at this for around 8 years now, and eating up all the literature, but in an academic context, and seeing how scholars wrestle with this. So, for example, there's a guy named Ephraim Spicer. He wrote a Genesis commentary for Yale, and he was the first one I saw. This is back in 1962, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
He connected it to the Persian Gulf. That was the first time I saw any connection to that location. So why does the Genesis text, if it is indeed, and it is, a polemical argument against the ancient Near East, yet at the same time, for, I guess you could say, Israelites that might be, say, post-Babylonian period, so post-exilic, they can read the text, have not much of an inkling of an idea of what's going on pre-Babylon, make those connections, because things like Ugaritic gets lost by the time the Qumran, the Maccabees and all that. So how is it that they can still accurately maintain an interpretation that aligns with history, and at the same time the text is able to be a polemic for those ancient readers? I mean, and again, this comes back down to source criticism, because is the Genesis text like the whole JDP thing? Does it appear in the 6th century, or is it at the time of Moses, or is it a history that goes pre-Abraham? Stuff like that.
I mean, when you say aligns with history, are you referring to, reading the days as epochs and evolutionary development?
Well, not just that, but also for example, in the lecture I mentioned that the Pishon River, which then in 98 it became known as the Kuwait River, that only with subtle shuttle imagery, they were able to see the dry riverbed. And yet we know, and when they went and investigated that alluvial fan, they knew that, oh, this thing dried out 3000 BC. And therefore, how would a Yahwist in the 600s BC know about this river? Like, why would he write about it? So there's this, is it an ancient memory, or is it an actual legitimate, in this case from a Christian context, and an inspiration where God works with these people's thinking, but he doesn't download data, like he's working with them and writing these texts and so on.
I mean, so with the river, there are people at Hopkins that work with satellite imagery, and this is what they do. So I don't want to speak too much to it, but the assumption is that river, that dried up riverbed, is the river that's referred to, right? And that's an assumption. And so I guess I would want to see definitive evidence, one, that is specifically the river that they're referring to. And I don't know how you would, I don't know how you do that.
So James Hoffmeyer, the Egyptologist, he actually, and not just him, Gordon Wenham, James Hoffmeyer, they actually, it was conjectured, okay, is this river the so-called Pishon, that's the missing Pishon? Gihon is still a little bit of a conjecture, because Gihon either could be above the Armenian mountains, or like coming from the Armenian mountains, or it could be actually up from where the Red Sea is. So it's one of the two, because Kush, it depends on where you put Kush. But Pishon then, these words then are loan words. So they're not originally Hebrew words. And so James Hoffmeyer then made a connection between the Wadi al-Batin fan, which then in the lecture you hear me about Jeffrey Rose, where Jeffrey Rose, like pretty much, it was like a groundbreaking research he made in 2010 that you have a human settlement in the Persian Gulf, and then he actually connected the Wadi al-Batin fan, which independently James Hoffmeyer is connecting, independent from Jeffrey Rose's work, and Gordon Wenham as well, and so on. So I hope you realize that I myself am not, this is not original to me, but at the same time I'm trying to be honest with the scholarly works that are being presented, and I'm not appealing to fringe Zitchin work.
I mean, I think I think you have to do that, right? I mean, in the same way that if we talk about Hoffmeyer and we talk about his views on the Exodus, for example, I'm not an expert in Egyptian history. I've taken Egyptian history classes and whatever, but I would have to go to Dr. Maggie Bryson or someone at her level and say, what do you think? And I do, right? So
we do too, by the way.
Yeah, we love her.
She's awesome. Thank you for introducing.
She is amazing.
She'll be back next week, by the way.
She'll
be back next week.
Awesome.
We might end up
just quickly.
What do you?
Just quickly, what does she think of Hoffmeyer's work in the Egypt's context? Just a quick comment on that.
Hoffmeyer and Kenneth Kitchen.
Yeah.
They tend to be really good scholars until they get to something like the Exodus, and then my wife said, Megan said, they find the evidence they're looking for. That's sort of the opinion.
There's confirmation bias there of sorts.
Yeah, and this is the thing that I worry about. And I guess, like Rob, when I listened to your presentation, let's talk about Psalm 104 for a second. Psalm 104, I've heard come up in a couple of videos of yours, and this idea that the waters run down and never to again go back over, right? And then you cite Job 38, Proverbs 8, and Jeremiah 5.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me because, in particular, Jeremiah 5, the point, particularly in those passages, is that God has established that in the text that the shoreline, right, where the waves come up, that's it, right? That the primordial water was there, He pushed the waters down. That's their boundary, right? He set that limit. That's his power, that he can keep them down there, right? And I think we could talk about geographical implications of that from their mindset, but it's not really relevant here. So, but the problem is to read into Psalm 104:9 this idea that that it'll never again go back over the waters, and so here this is a creation psalm, which are absolutely right. You know, I don't know.
Okay, I want you to say that again because younger creationists say that Psalm 104 is not about the creation.
They have to, right? I mean, if you read Psalm 104:9 and it doesn't go over, well, wait a minute, that's got to be a flood. So, but the problem is that I don't think that that's what verse 9 means. You know, the Hebrew structure there is it's a form of shuv, and it has to do with, and it definitely can mean never again do that. But the idea here is not, I think, that there was a time when it ran over its banks and now he's pushed it back down and all right, now it's not going to come up anymore. But it's that they came down and now it won't return again because he set that boundary. I think he's speaking nomically here, right? As the general principle.
Is David linking, because it's a psalm against the Egyptian creation hymn, isn't it? The Atum creation hymn, as far as I know. I mean, oh, by the way, when I say David, because the Dead Sea Scrolls have David mentioned, and I will admit that I'm saying David because of that, not
sure, that's fine.
100%. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an expert on the Psalms.
Okay.
So
but then
you'll find no problem.
Now this is what I find interesting, because in natural history of the planet, you do have a water world that then, through tectonic uplift and so on, you do have then the emergence of land that it's at its current 29-ish% or something. So, and you saw that in my lecture. I give a graphic of a water world, and then never again will the waters cover the globe again. So you have a primeval ocean, and then now it's fixed. You see that in Job 38, Proverbs 8.
Yeah, but
so
again,
why that correlation then?
Okay, so the two things, the fixing, again, that we're talking about here, I think you're reading too much into it, given the context of those other passages that you cite. So what they're stating is that, you know, now that God has brought forth land, you know, the waves, even though they want to come back over, God has fixed their boundary there at the shoreline. So just that doesn't mean that I don't think that in any way negates, you know, bringing the waters back up over, because let's say that's the case. I mean, he's broken that with any kind of flood, right? Because any water that comes over any shoreline breaks that rule, right? So I guess the point here is that if you're looking at what that text is saying, it's that the boundary has been set in a perspective of looking at nature in general, right? What are the powers that God has set in place in nature? Well, look, he's holding back the waters from coming back over the continental world or whatever that they have. But I don't think that you can read specifically into that something like, well, this makes it so that there can't be a worldwide flood, because that's not what that text is doing. I think that's reading far too much into it.
How would you, because from an ancient Near Eastern cosmological context, verse 6 of Psalm 104 would be verse 2 of Genesis 1, right? Like there would be a connection in that you have this void of water that then you have like a bubble, you know, this vacuum, hence the rakia, then the land appearing, and then you have this ordered state. So if you speak about any flood, any localized flood, it's not going back to that original. Let's pretend we are ancient Near Eastern people having this discussion, and you're telling me then that the entire world went back to the way Genesis 1:2 describes it, in the flood. But yet David is saying, never again will this ever happen, and he's thinking back pre-flood.
Right. So again, I would be hesitant to, and I wouldn't say, I suppose, never again, in the sense that you're using it.
Okay.
What I would say is that, if I were to say, hey, I've got a pool, and it rains and the water keeps coming out of the pool, so I built these sides up. I know that's not how pools work. Sorry, but I can't think of another example.
Right.
And so now the water won't come out anymore. That doesn't mean that there's never, ever going to be a time that the water doesn't come out of there. I'm speaking nomically. I'm speaking as a general rule, right? This is not going to come out. That's the point of the text. And I mean, if you read the Jeremiah 5 passage, we don't have to, but
okay, I understand what you mean, but is it true that the earth was indeed a water world?
I mean, this is, sorry, are you asking what the text says or what?
So, well, now I'm sort of having one foot in the text and one foot in reality, so to speak.
Sure.
Yeah. So, because I'm trying to line, because as a Christian, I'm seeing if my model of, well, and it's interpretation that doesn't nullify the ancient Near Eastern context, but I'm just experimenting a little bit with seeing if the text has a future
applicability
with a more informed understanding of reality. So so basically, was the world water world, and will the world ever become a water world? And the science material says no way, because now you have tectonic uplifts that will then remain fixed.
Yeah, I mean, so again, by having one foot in reality and one foot in the text, you then have to go back to the text and say, well, now wait a minute, tectonics or whatever can't have the water come back over. So that means that Psalm 104:9 has to mean that that's what it's referring to. And so then Genesis 6 and through 9 can't be a worldwide flood. And okay. I guess what I'm saying is that if the text isn't doing that, right, if the text isn't trying to give a scientific or what we would consider to be a historical account, then there's no problem, right? Again, I don't aspire to the biblical text the same level of sacredness, whatever that you wanna call it.
Right.
But even if I did, in the same way that I know I used this example before, but there's no reason for you to go to a passage that talks about David day and night his tears being his food and trying to come up with an ancient Near Eastern dietary description of how tears were able to be eaten. You say, well, that's a poetic text. It's doing something else.
Yeah.
And that would be what I would say, because again, the language of the text requires that from the mind of the speaker, from the mind of the writer, in his opinion, it fits with the motif. It has to fit with the motif of a flood that encompasses all of their world, right? All of it. So all of life, all of humanity, all beasts, plants, everything is underwater, which fits with their cosmic geography, because that's the point of it. When Enlil,
but notice it's not explicit. It doesn't explicitly say. The text doesn't like in the flood narrative. It doesn't explicitly say the kol basar, the all flesh, like this particular flesh is underwater, and this. I mean, it's very ambiguous, and so therefore, would an ancient Near Eastern person be thinking of species that didn't even exist in their region? Well, like the kangaroo and so on.
No, of course not. But I think that's the point, right? Is that reading back into the text things that we know, I think is something dangerous to do from an interpretive standpoint. So, but I'm thinking of Genesis 6:7 here. And the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move along the ground. I regret that I have made them. I mean, this totality fits. I mean, it's the motif of flood narratives in the ancient Near East. So when Enlil creates, and the gods are burdened, and so they want to have humanity to do the work, and then they get really noisy, and Enlil can't sleep, and so he wants to wipe them all out, right? And this is a horrible thing for the birth goddess. All of my creation is going to die. Why would I let this happen? And Enki kind of, Ea in that text saves the day, right? And by preserving that small group, and otherwise humanity would have been gone. So from their perspective, there wasn't, like you're saying, there wasn't a globe and there wasn't stuff on the other side of it. They're thinking of this area and the water's covering it and everything's going to die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that. And therefore, is it okay? Let me ask you this question: is it an error of mine to then see if there is indeed a historical precedence for these stories, and if there is, and it happens to be obviously a very large localized flooding, is it an error of mine to then make that connection? Because that entire region, if it's flooded, I mean, talking about Sumer and so on, that entire region does indeed. And by the way, you saw me give the mathematical measurements of the horizon would be only like 12 kilometers away, but yet from an area perspective, you're talking 700,000 square kilometers of water, which obviously in that context, it looks like everything is flooded.
I mean, again, I think this is an interpretive approach where you're looking at this and saying, all right, so Noah's a real guy and he's on a real boat. And so what can he really see? And I guess what I would argue is that given the motif of the flood narrative and what it's doing, that wasn't a question that they asked themselves, right? How tall was he? And, those weren't issues that they wrestled with, because
I guess what I'm saying is why do these stories even exist if it never happened historically?
Oh, I mean, for the same reason I think that any other mythological text exists. I mean, Gilgamesh, I don't think that anybody would argue that Gilgamesh was actually a guy that wrestled with Enkidu and they went off and killed Humbaba, you Akkadian lovers.
But good Saturday.
Yeah, but nobody would argue that. But that's it's a mythological text that's trying to, Gilgamesh was a guy, we think. I mean, he was a real king, but certainly he didn't do those things. And the thing is, from an evangelical standpoint, nobody has a problem with that, because that text isn't sacred, that text isn't holy, so we don't wrestle with those kinds of problems, or look for development and evolutionary history in the Gilgamesh epic or something. Right. I guess if we look at this, I mean, we can talk. I guess we can go back and forth about what makes logical sense, broader logical sense, or something. But if we stick strictly with the grammar, I think that it's problematic. For example, another thing, I heard Hugh Ross, Dr. Ross, was it yesterday?
Yep.
On the podcast?
Yep.
He made this assertion that I've heard a number of places, that this Et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz, this heaven and earth, that this means the universe, and that it means matter, what it is, space and time and energy, and it doesn't mean the heavens that we see and the earth that we see here, as opposed to the water, right? And that doesn't work. So if you look at, at least the argument that he presented doesn't work. So when both of those terms are used with the definite article, then it means, if I'm remembering his argument correctly, that means the totality of the universe, and nothing individualized there. So the earth, which allows then, right, for God to create in the beginning the heavens and the earth, but that just means the universe in general, but not the actual earth. The problem with that, if you go to Genesis 2:4, and I'll just pull it up here.
It's the reverse way.
Well, it actually shows both. So it has, these are generations, Hashamayim, v'ha'aretz. So both definite there. So this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. The Lord God made, and there it's just eretz v'shamayim, indefinite. So, I mean, if that's the case, that we're talking about the universe being this. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, just again, that's interesting that you bring that up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to label out for you the people that Hugh Ross is depending on, and then I've gone and read everyone's analysis of the Hebrew there, and I completely agree with you that Genesis 2:4 is exactly like that, and all of them mentioned that. So they ultimately try and, in a summary sense, they'll say verse 1 is actually a merism phrase, a compound noun, like a butterfly. So heavens and earth is like a compound. It means totality, everything. The Genesis 2:4 reference then is actually mostly about the fact that there's a differentiation between heaven and earth. And the other time that so therefore the phrase in verse 1 doesn't actually appear in Genesis 2:4, but it does appear again in Joel 3, somewhere around verse 15, I think it is, where it encompasses the sun, moon, and stars in that passage. So then, therefore, people so I didn't mention the people that Hugh Ross is depending on. So Bruce Walke, John Sailhammer, Gleason Archer would be one, Walter Kaiser would be another one. I think Spicer mentioned it, and there's a guy named Everett Fox. He's not a Christian, but he's a scholar I think he's passed away, I'm not sure, but he wrote he gave a translation of the Torah, a very interesting translation, and he in a footnote highlights the merism and so on.
So there's no question. Yeah. Let's be clear. I'd wrestle. Yeah. I would be very surprised if Bruce Waltke argued that here that this merism, because clearly is a merism. There's no question about that, or it can be used as a merism, but that it doesn't involve constituent parts, I think, is problematic, and I struggle to think that Waltke would make the argument that the earth is not indicated, that the actual earth is not indicated as part of that merism in Genesis 1, to the point that the earth itself was not created, right? That it was matter. I struggle to think that he would argue.
Right. And then it comes down to, if you look at the JPS translation, the Jewish Publication Society, and a few recent ones, I use the ISV Bible, which actually, I don't know if you'll like this, it actually says universe. Yeah. In the beginning, God created the universe. Yeah.
And that's fine, right? But I don't mind that being the case, right? Because if you read how this is used in the prophets, how this merism is used in the Psalms, that's one of the ways that we understand the word universe, the way that we use it in English, is this idea, right? The totality of the world, right? What I would say is that to then read, it's sort of like, no, I won't do that. Give another example of an example. I tend to do that a lot, sorry. What I would say is that there's a certain meaning of universe that we use, a very scientific or forensic, definition. And then to read that into the use there, that's the problem. So to make the argument that, well, God could not have created the earth and the heavens because that doesn't follow the chronological layout that I need. So I have to make it mean like space-time continuum or something, or the energy.
No, but that's where I was going to get at that particular point, which I think is a good point you're raising. Because this is where I personally am wrestling with the Bereshit, whether it's an independent clause or a dependent clause, because of the vowel pointing. Like the vowel pointing is very clearly saying, not in the beginning, but when God began to create. And therefore, if that's the case, even though I'm a Hugh Ross fan, and all the scholars are, great, I would have to concede that no, this is speaking about, in this case, heaven and earth, and therefore the first creative act would not be the merism phrase, but actually light in verse 3. So when God was about to do this, and the earth was this, formless and void and so on, God said, let there be light. So that would be, if it's a dependent clause, that would be the first creative act. But that's where I see, for example, Walter Kaiser, I see him as a very sharp opponent to allowing the Masoretic vowel pointing to communicate that translation. Because he, coming from an Ugaritic background, I think he made a few connections back saying, no. Even though you have in the Enuma Elish, I think it is, that when the gods, that therefore we should not import that, because then that's kind of related to source criticism, and he being more conservative wants to say, no, Genesis is more like in the beginning sort of thing. Yeah, so... I think just to summarize this discussion so far, what I'm seeing in this is that I don't actually disagree with what your analysis of what I presented. I appreciate that you've acknowledged the scholarly context behind it, that leaving aside the text, that there was indeed. And by the way, yeah, the science material I was referring to, these guys did not even have Genesis in mind. All they were doing was just that. So at least that can be established. But I understand that you're wanting to. I hate to use this term, but I think it's applicable. You're wanting to trap not just you, but everyone that looks at the text. You're wanting to trap them in that particular interpretation, which in this case means, well, I don't even know if you can use the word global, but just everything is flooded, and then that's it. I think is that the best way to describe what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, so again, if you were to let's pretend that Genesis 1 is not Genesis 1, right? This revered holy book, or this revered holy chapter of this book. And that we're reading another Sumerian or Akkadian text, right? We wouldn't be trying to find epochs of time in the days, right? If we were to read one of the Enki creation stories where he has sex with the ground and ejaculates and creates the Tigris and the Euphrates River, right? We wouldn't be reading that and trying to, figure out what evolutionary stage that fits. We would say, well, that's interesting.
But is that local or universal?
Well,
that phrase.
Yeah, so that's
why? And that's the thing. Why would they even bring that up? The Euphrates.
Well, I mean that's their source of life, right? I mean that's this. But
because, like, why? Like, why not mention another river somewhere?
I don't understand the question. I mean,
because again, I'm connecting it with human anthropology, that humans are located there in that region. And so that the identification of those particular rivers goes literally a one-to-one correspondence with human migration patterns out of Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula.
All right, but take it, just take it back out of, it's this holy chapter.
Okay.
I don't think you'd have any problem with the phrase, there was evening and there was morning the first day, there was evening and there was morning the second day. I don't think those would cause you any problem. But because we're looking back at this chapter in particular and we're saying, okay, look, this is a literal presentation of how God created. But I know that from an evolutionary standpoint and from, development of human history, that this is what happened. Well, if God wrote this thing, I've got to figure out how it is that he left room, that he indicated in such a way that these two things can concord, right? And what I hear in your presentation, one of the ways that you do that is this, day-age theory, right? That a day is an epoch. And what I'm saying is that from a linguistic standpoint, I don't know how you would do that. And what I mean by that is, it seems very untenable to argue that these are anything but solar days, right? These are 24-hour periods, and this is what the text is indicating. And it makes sense from a literary standpoint, and it also makes sense from and I'm sure you've heard this verse 10 billion times, but Exodus 20:11, right?
Yeah.
And but this is the reality, right? I mean, I think it's a solid argument. I knew you.
Which have you heard of the counter to Exodus 20:11?
No, please.
So, which I find curious, especially those King James onlyist young creationists.
They're awesome.
We're having a King James only debate coming up in 2 weeks.
It's going to be glorious.
Yep,
absolutely glorious.
Who's debating?
Which
Sam's one guy off of Twitter. I'll send you the names. Their last names escape me right now, so I don't want to butcher those. But Sam's one of them.
Okay, very good. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Okay. Oh my gosh, the whole King James thing. Anyway,
it's great.
Imagine Utnapishti speaking in King James Elizabethan English. That would just be and Enlil, anyway.
What doest thou?
Yeah. Who's the guy that he was shocked that he survived? Like thou survivest the flood? Yeah. So in the King James version, you have the preposition in italics, because the King James translator knew that there's no Hebrew word there, and so because of English grammar, he put it in there. But in italics, it means it's not in the Hebrew.
What phrase you talking?
And again, in Exodus 20 verse 11, it says for in 6 days, but for 6 days apparently is how the Hebrew reads. And again, you have these Hebrew scholars like Archer, Kaiser, and so on that'll say, you'll then have a corresponding, if you see Yom there as being an indefinite period of time, let's not say epoch, because epoch's too modern in saying it, but then you have a 6-to-1 pattern of working 6, resting 1, which by the way corresponds with a lot of ancient cultures, because again, you're talking lunar calendar and so on, which corresponds with the 7-week and so on, 7-day week. So then God's then working in that and saying, look, well, I'm speaking here as a Christian now. That's God saying, I work in a quote unquote God week, but it's not 24 hours. Obviously, I don't see why would he say I work 24 hours? Then I'm relying on the scholars that say, yeah, it's a pattern of 6-to-1, not literally 24 hours, that then gets applied to the Sabbath rest of the land. So for example, you work the land 6 years, rested 1 year. So there's a 6-to-1 pattern there again, all in connection with the creation narrative. So, and actually, since you're here, I need clarification on this. I've heard that the Erev and the Boker words, the morning and evening, evening and morning, Erev and Boker, that they actually, if you reverse back into, I think Ugaritic being a parent language to Hebrew, is it? Is Ugaritic parent or?
I mean, I don't know if I'd call it a parent language. I mean, it's certainly, related. Yeah, that's a related language, sure.
Or like okay.
Yeah.
That it can communicate a form of chaotic to ordering.
I heard you say that in you did a video, I think recently, with another guy in Australia, and I can't remember his name now.
James Higgins.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you mentioned that, and actually I heard it, and I thought, where did he get that? Because there's been actually an awful lot of work on comparisons of Genesis 1 and 2 with Ugaritic text.
Yeah.
And so I went a searching and trying to find it, and and when I couldn't find anything, I actually emailed a friend of mine up at Hopkins. He might be listening right now, and he doesn't know of it. I mean, I looked at my Ugaritic dictionary, looking for the words chaos and order.
Well, not specifically chaos order, but I'm what I read was, and I'm reading Genesis commentaries from the 1800s. We're talking, like, I have Logos, and I have like 50 different, and some of those guys speak about those words as being just like evening means twilight, but then there's this nuance of a disordering taking place, but then morning is something about like an ordering, a reverse of disordering. And so then if you have this pattern of, I hate to use this, the epochs as being from a disorder to an order, then a disorder to an order. And then interestingly, there's no disorder order with respect to day 7. You just have this like from the start of creation till humanity. And then God rests.
Yeah, I mean, so I would need to see. So again, I kind of go back to the plain reading of the text from the Hebrew, and if the text is going to great lengths to say evening and morning, one day, day 1, first day, however you want to read it, evening and morning, second day, evening and morning, third day. I mean, I feel like you would need to have a tremendous preponderance of evidence to go against reading that as a typical day in the eyes of the reader. And given that Yom Echad is used this way as a day, juxtaposed to amounts of other, different one day as opposed to 2 or 3 or 5. So clearly is used that way. So if the natural reading of the text, what I would consider to be the natural reading of the text linguistically, is to say a day, which is the natural meaning of Yom, and then it goes further to say evening and morning, I don't see any evidence to read it as an epoch. And again, I don't feel the need to make it say something like that because, and honestly, Rob, I don't think you need to do it either. Sorry, just speaking candidly, I don't think it affects in any way your belief or the validity of your belief as an evangelical. I'm assuming you're an evangelical. Sorry.
I'm a Christian, but I don't really hold to.
Okay. But I mean, as a Christian, I don't think that if right now you could be 100% convinced that Genesis 1 is a mythological text and that it doesn't have this that this Bible passage doesn't have this depth of like the secret Gnostic sort of, not Gnostic isn't a good word to use here, but this like secret knowledge that we can tap into later on and read back into it. And that's all it is. It doesn't in any way hurt your position because the text, if the text is just saying Yahweh did it, not Marduk, then the truth of that text is valid.
But you see, I've actually spoken with Michael Heiser. I'm sure you know who Michael Heiser is. Yeah. And I interviewed him, and when it came time for me to have my 10 minutes with him, I went full steam ahead with that. And he told me exactly what you said. And I see what you're saying.
What's his position, Rob? Sorry, because you cite him a lot. What's his
position is exactly what you said. Let the Bible be what it is. Like I'll kind of like verbatim repeat what he says. Let the Bible be what it is. He'll then say, if an atheist comes to you and ridicules, in this case, your faith, because look, see, the Genesis text got it wrong, then all you need to do is respond to him saying, it makes no sense that you are bashing a text that has nothing to do with science anyway.
Yeah.
But now what flows through my mind is this sensus planor nature of the text. This, like, basically, much later down the track, Pesher exegesis by the early Christians, that you have, for example, Hosea 11 has nothing to do with Jesus, yet Matthew takes that, the Son of God coming out of Israel coming out of Egypt, and Jesus is also coming out of Egypt. And then there's these parallels, and they make a theology that,
Sure.
So, but you see, interestingly, Heiser will, and this is something I wish I could ask Heiser, but I guess I'm too nice or too, because he's my guest, so I don't want to put him on the spot. But he in his work, like especially his work, The Unseen Realm, which is brilliant, will make an argument that Paul in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 8, Paul says, the plan of God was a complete secret, even to the aeons, even to the spiritual divine council. Even the good angels didn't know the plan. And so therefore, that's why it's foolishness to this world, the cross, and so on, because until it finalized, then now we know that, now we know the secret of salvation in Christ and so on. But if he can do that, then why not this?
But even then, I mean, Peter didn't. It certainly wasn't revealed to Peter at that time, because Peter's still under the impression that the entire world was destroyed.
But then you see in the Greek the qualified tote, because now I look at the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament is like the go-to dictionary for Greek, and it says that cosmos can be translated as humanity.
Yeah, it definitely does. And so I heard that in your presentation. I would probably refer you also to, because TDNT is fine. I would also use Bauer, Dankert, and Gingrich BDAG, which is like
that's another good one. Yeah.
But the use of Tate there, at that time, I mean, I don't know. I was trying to figure out what your argument was about that. The world at that time, humanity at that time. What is your argument there?
So then I'm arguing that we know that humanity was, again, localized in that region. And Peter, in the Pride chapter, in chapter 2, connects the flood with Sodom and Gomorrah. So I can't see Peter going, oh, look, Sodom and Gomorrah is this localized thing, that catastrophe that happened. And then suddenly he just switches gear and makes it this global thing, when really the language is such that, and as the dictionary argued, that basically both instances are speaking about humanity in those localized regions, whether it's Sodom, whether it's the flood.
I mean, I didn't see, so I looked at it. I mean, I didn't see anything about a localized region. What I would say is the commonality that those two things have, Sodom and Gomorrah and the flood, are not, to localized versus worldwide, but the totality of destruction.
But I'm not denying that. It is.
Yeah. What I'm saying is, though, if we go with that logic, what Peter knew at that time was that all of humanity was destroyed. Whether he thought that the world was this big or whatever he thought, all of it was destroyed. And I guess that's my argument, that even at this point, if we're trying to say that, Paul, for example, was given this, mystery, the secrets that weren't known to the angelic realm, certainly Peter appears to not know about a globe, right? Peter appears to not know about the Americas. And I guess that's my point, is that we can either say that these texts are reflecting what they understood, and that's it, or we can say that, which is what the text would bear out grammatically and syntactically and contextually, or we can say that that's what it's saying, but there's this like deeper meaning that we can get to knowing what we know now and read back into it. And what I'm saying is I just don't think that's necessary, and I think it probably will ultimately do damage to a natural reading of the text.
But then why the unnecessary details that appear in the text? Like I can think of so many things. Like for example, why can't there be a text that just says Yahweh did it? Why?
Oh.
So again, going back to Genesis 1, why the specific mention of the earth was like this, but then it became like this. Then you have landmass appearing from water. Then you have, why that structure like that?
Well, so let me put it back to you. In your presentation, you made mention of, I think it was the size of the ark, or...
Oh, yeah, base 60, size of the ark.
But, or maybe it was the years. Yeah, maybe it was the years of Genesis 5.
Yeah.
And you made the comment that, we don't know why there's like some special use of the numbers here. And what they're symbolic. You're talking about 969, 153. My question, I think, turn right back around on you and say, why not just say how old they were? Why not just use real years? Why not just tell us what the real size of the ark was? Why make it this figurative thing? If we're trying to write history, why not just use real numbers, the actual numbers?
But we know, because we know those can't be real numbers.
Right, but why not? Why wouldn't God use real numbers? You know what I mean?
Oh, right. But right. So then, I guess, and I'm conjecturing here, but so I might need you to clarify. Would not Genesis 1 to 11 be under the category of this ancient Near Eastern? We're talking, and when I say ancient Near Eastern, I'm not talking a recent form of ancient Near. I'm talking pre-Abraham, that context where base 60 mathematics was the norm. And so therefore the numberings that are given there very naturally fit with the base 60 number system, not the numbering systems you see post Abraham that have very natural ages given.
I mean, so let's
the Sumerian king list, for example, matches exactly with
28,800 years. It's amazing how many people live for 28,800 years.
Right.
Exactly. What a great number. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point. I don't disagree with you that these numbers aren't meant to be. Well, I can't get into the mind of what the person that put the text down was thinking, but I mean, certainly these numbers have symbolic function. My point is, in bringing that up, is that
I think I know what your point is.
Oh, sorry.
Do you want me to?
Yes, please.
Clarify. Okay, so I think what you're saying is that I get that, that what I just said. But then, if God is the one wanting to communicate something, if He can do so, in my argument, in an accurate way in Genesis 1, why can't He do that in Genesis 5 and 6? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, So let's say, for example, just pulling something out of our hat here, that He uses the number 777, right? And He's trying to show
Lamech's age.
Yeah, the totality of completion or something. I don't know. I'm not a number expert here, but He's saying that it's the totality of completion. 7 is a complete number, whatever. What is the truth of that number? Is the truth of that number His age? Well, no, I think we would argue that He wasn't 777 years old. Some people would. I understand that. But the truth is that He's trying to get across this idea of totality, just for the sake of argument. I don't think that's... But if that's the case, then a number that doesn't represent an actual age is being used in a way to show or to communicate truth in a way that is not what we would consider to be historically sound. I don't know. So
right. if as in the sense of biological age, it's not sound. Like I think is what you're saying.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, that in the same way that day and night my tears have been my food are not meant to relay dietary habits, but to relay His sadness and how distraught He is that He's not eating. If the truth of that statement is His sadness, we don't worry about the factual nature of Him actually eating His tears. And if Genesis is a genre, and we know it's a genre, a cosmological genre, in the ancient Near East, and that genre is used, as we see like in Enuma Elish with the Babylonian and the Assyrian versions, that those texts are used to argue for the power and dominance, supremacy of a particular deity. That's the truth that text is trying to relay. And why can't we do that? Why can't we just let Genesis 1 do that?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not asking for an answer.
Yeah, but since the recording of that flood lecture I gave, I've been digging more into the numbers, and I came across. I wish I could bring it up right now, but I came across a paper which, interestingly, the guy who wrote the paper lives 20 minutes away from me. He's actually a lecturer at a university adjacent to where I'm studying.
Nice.
In ancient Near Eastern literature and so on. He actually gave a very, and this is recent. This wasn't at the time when I was making that video. That when you add up the days, when you add up the years given in Genesis 5, that it could have been, and again, this goes back to source criticism, that if you're talking about an import of stuff into the text that may not have originally been in the text, when you add up those ages given all the way up to Moses, because again, if this story is honing in specifically for Israel, so you have scholars like Seth Postel that speak of Adam and Israel typology, that basically the whole of the Torah is for a Jew, not outside Israel. It's not really meant for those. So what this guy did was add them up, and then it adds up to 12,800 years. But if you divide it by 10, you get this 1280 figure, which you see right throughout Revelation and also in Daniel and so on, like 1280 days or something. I think is the so-called until the eschaton or something. And then he was like, "Oh, this is a bit peculiar because now you have a factor of 10 difference. So you have 12,800 years from the time of Adam to Moses." And I forget now ultimately what he's trying to argue, but there is this correlation, and a few people have picked up on that. But it's a work that's not many commentaries know about, basically. Yeah. But it's a genuine work. Yeah. So then I was looking at it and going, hang on a second, that's interesting. So you have the Sumerian king list. You then have, for example, Enoch with the 365 figure, which again corresponds to the solar year. That's a conjecture, but you do have Second Temple literature that connect Enoch with, because he's the teacher, like an astronomer, and and then this guy is connecting those ages. It could be an import of those ages. So, but are you then saying that every so in Genesis 1, when God's doing the speaking and the creating, that therefore he has to mechanically inspire. So this comes back to this issue of inspiration then. So he has to like I'm going to import Islam here. Like in Islamic theology, you already have a set book that Allah then mechanically literally downloads into the minds of these people, which I don't believe. I believe that they were writing. I don't believe God was physically going, okay, I want you to spell it like this.
Sure.
And then not put a full stop. I think these people are writing, and whether it's through providence, epiphany moments, whatever, that would then be the quote unquote, like wind filling up a sail, as Peter argues.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
yeah.
Then, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think, I think a mechanical view of inspiration probably wouldn't be generally held in the evangelical community.
Well, King James only is.
Sure. Yeah. Except for that very solid scholarly community.
Well, but then I don't know. for example, when I recently wrote, well, since you accessed my Sentinel website, I don't know if you looked at any of the other articles I put. Okay, so there's a few others where I one of the first ones I put, like straight after the flood one, was me saying why Christians should not use Leviticus 18:22 to speak about homosexuality and to debate homosexuals on because then I was looking at.
Did you send that to G-Man or?
Well, actually, G-Man and all they know about this. I made the argument that from Baruch Levine and a few other scholars that are not Christian, they're Jew, but they specialize in specifically Leviticus studies, that this notion of the why it's an abomination is all about the semen being, if two men have sex, it's the semen that gets quote unquote murdered. And so that's why it's an abomination, because life for life argument. So therefore, I'm arguing that when Jesus comes on the scene, the entire Torah is done away with. And because these are man-made stipulations that God accommodates. So therefore, and a lot of the evangelical community nail me on a cross, because now they're saying, oh, you don't believe in the inerrancy, and like this is like, because when you said the evangelical community won't see this mechanically, but just that one example tells me that they do see it mechanically. That, a woman's hand getting chopped off is literally what God wants humanity to practice in Deuteronomy 25. And actually, it's from the Middle Assyrian text. So, anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but just to clarify to you my position on that.
I think that would be a, I hate to do this. I hate to get in the middle, but we're hitting the 2 hour mark, and we have some questions that we want to get to. But okay. I think that bringing you guys back at some point to continue this, I like the direction it was going right there. I think that would be a good pickup spot. But this was amazing. I mean, me and Steve could have taken the night off and just let you guys hold the reins, because we didn't say a word. But Steve has some questions from the.
Can Joshua just clarify, like make a final?
Oh, sure, yeah.
I think he was wanting to make a clarification.
Sure,
yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely.
About inspiration. Is that what you're?
Oh, just I don't know. I think you're wanting to say something. Maybe.
Oh, I was just going to say that this was like the nicest debate I've ever had.
I know. How do you not have
nice
a nice
guy,
debate with Robert? Right.
It was substantive though. And,
yeah.
By the way, what time is it there, Robert? I didn't even.
It's 10:15 in the morning.
Well, listen, we live on air disproved flat Earth because it's dark here, and we watch the sun rise on.
Yeah, look, you can actually
say that.
Now, look, we're all part of
that's external lighting that he has.
I got my check a couple hours ago from the scientific community.
Exactly, NASA shields.
No, what happens is we have the Australian government actually designate a specific light.
That's a spotlight.
Okay, guys, it's time now to put a light on here. And
that's a spotlight. And by the way, Robert, it's good to see that your strap worked in well, and you're not upside down. So
spontaneous harness.
Yeah, honestly, now that's something
you did. Yeah. You like you're strapped.
No, that's how heavy I am. That
But I think Steve has some questions from the audience, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
Not a lot, just kind of like two things. One of them you kind of touched on, but if we kind of like touch on a little bit more, one of the whole things for this narrative of the Bible was that God was eliminating everybody. He was killing everybody. So why would it just be a local flood if the whole point of the story is that God wanted to get rid of everybody? And I'll just throw in the other question at the same time because it's related. And this was my question, actually. In Genesis, it talks about it being 15 cubits high of water. That's 22 feet. That would kill a lot of people. I mean, that's pretty tall. So, I mean, do you think that a local flood would have a 20-foot or 22-foot height for a local flood?
So that's actually ammunition for me, because I bring that up in my lecture, and I say, look. Isn't it interesting that the 2015 paper actually speaks about a certain height level, and the author gives around a 20 foot like flood plane that takes place in that Persian Gulf region, which seems to correspond with the 15 cubits. And so therefore, coming back to you, Joshua, maybe you can clarify. 15 cubits on top of the har being like because there's various ways you can translate mountain, elevated, mound. So is the text saying 15 cubits above the mountain, or is it 15 cubits with respect to the location in the vicinity? So therefore, it's 15 or 22.5 feet of water that would be above that region, with above the mounds over there, but it's not covering places like Ararat and Everest, because if you're going to talk about, I'm going to import it into a modern sense. If you're going to talk about Everest being covered, the young earth creationists don't seem to realize you need cabin pressure for the ark, and so on. So yeah.
So again, taking it out of 21st century perspective, going back, they're not considering things like that because. And
I would agree. Obviously, I'm just
when you read the whole point of the Noah character letting these birds out is that trying to find land, right? Mm-hmm. So when land comes in sight, be it in Nagu or be it in an Akkadian text or the mountaintops in the biblical text. I think that's the point. That it's that height is covering everything. So.
Okay. But you see that again, that detail I find suspiciously coincidental. Maybe that's the key word I'm getting that I should have mentioned at the start. There's just too much coincidences of correspondence. More so with Genesis than with the other ancient Near Eastern texts.
The problem is that, and I understand coincidence can be compelling, but I think that the amount of force that you have to put on the text to make it bend, for example, reading these epochs in Yom in Genesis 1, or trying to find this deeper meaning.
And I was thinking of the cubits as well, the 15 cubits.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
So, if you have a handful of things that are coincidentally similar or seem accurate, like Dr. Ross was talking about the stretching out of the world, and with the Big Bang. I think that's kind of silly. The idea of stretching out the heavens is a tent. So it's not this throwing it out there like that. It's stretching it out like a tent. So there's no real correlation in my mind to this Big Bang where everything's going out like that and how one sets up a tent.
I will quickly share. I know you want to go to the next question, Steve, but I will share what Hugh Ross, I think he contradicted himself last night. Because he said, which I guess you would appreciate, that when he said, I wouldn't go too far in applying an accelerating context, because only recently we know it's accelerating in its expansion.
Yeah.
But in his Matter of Days book, which he's done a 2015 update to, he does use Isaiah 40 verse 22, which again is classic ancient Near Eastern cosmology. And I'd agree with that. But then if you're going to then have this 1 foot in that and then a 1 foot in like a concordance context, he mentions, which again, I looked at it and it's interesting. It is in the Hebrew that you have an initial expansion that then becomes fixed and then an ongoing expansion from then on.
Where are you?
Apparently that's Isaiah 40 verse 22. I'll give you his, I'll read out what he argues. Let me just load it up quickly.
And while you're doing that, I want to say that Hugh mentioned yesterday a kind of a theory about finding fossils on the moon. And I believe I found someone that can come and speak to that. I'm trying to figure out a date on that, but hopefully we can get that person on to speak a little bit more in detail about that. So
I'll just comment very, very briefly on Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry, and this is debated sort of thing, at least on the finer points of it, but it's very common, and of course it's not just Hebrew poetry. This is a very ancient Near Eastern thing to do, is this repetition of ideas. Hebrew tends to do this thing where your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. So it's the repetition of a general idea, but in different words. Some people argue that there is specificity in :B. So a lamp under my feet would be a light that's shining down directly, but a light under my path is going forward, showing me the way. I mean, there are counter arguments to all that stuff. But so when I see here, he stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in, those are the same ideas. So the idea that there's yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything to that.
And that's where I would be more in your, even though I am, concordist, so to speak, I can definitely see, oh my goodness, Hugh, you are definitely, like, I'll just read out what he says here. He says, a third verb form, the imperfect, is used in combination with the active participle form in Isaiah 40 verse 22. The first part of the verse makes reference to the ongoing expansion of the universe, while the second part of the verse is most literally translated as, quote, and he has spread them, which is the heavens, out. The picture presented in this verse is one of God sitting enthroned above, constantly exercising his creative power by continually stretching out the heavens, with the added reference to the past completed act of God spreading out of the heavens. And so what he's doing is he's going, in inflationary Big Bang model, you do have an inflation, which then stops. And then through dark energy, you have this slow but accelerating continuation of the stretch. So it's like a big stretch, and then it goes like that. And he's saying that's in Isaiah 40:22. And then I'm like, I like the quote unquote coincidence or the thing you're making with the grammar, but I completely agree with Joshua on this.
The big stretch.
Yeah.
So the big stretch.
It's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah. Steve, I think that's it.
I think so. Actually, we don't have that much questions. Although people are fascinated by this, I guess we will be doing an after show of some sort. People want to continue this, but they don't seem to have much questions right now.
Sorry,
but maybe they will. I think though it kind of went quick.
Can I ask Joshua just one quick question?
Sure. But I just want to say real quick before you do that,
okay,
Dr. Ross. I do agree that you look at. I love his science, and I do. I think he's a very brilliant man. I do see, like you do, Robert, that of course he tries to take anything that he finds in science and tries to apply it to the Bible. I understand that he tries to do that, and I don't agree with his findings on that, of course. But I think that it's great that he's willing to listen. He's willing to have the conversations, and I think that he will change his mind given new evidence, and that I think is great. So,
yeah.
But anyways, go ahead.
Would you recommend, I guess and that's another thing, because I've still got a lot of updates to do to the original lecture I gave and all that. But would you recommend that, even though there is this concordist flavor that's mixed in the stuff that I made? Like, would you recommend that to anyone, or do you think it's amateurish?
I don't. I mean, I certainly wouldn't call it amateur. I mean, just, you're very well read. I mean, there's no question about it.
Well, I'm willing to admit if it's amateurish, then it's amateurish. So,
I mean, yeah. I guess what I would say is, I think if you learned Hebrew, you would see these things differently. And the thing is, I look at you and your capacity to learn, and I think, man, if he knew these languages, I mean, certainly are you an astrophysicist? Is that what you're studying?
I'm in physics and engineering. Yeah.
I mean, clearly you're a brain. I mean, there's no question about it. So I'm interested to see what would happen if you could process these languages, because you're obviously a brilliant guy. But yeah, I think you'd probably take a different spin on some of these things if you could read the language yourself.
Okay.
Sorry.
No,
that was
no, I appreciate that. That's something I was trying to like. I guess you could say wonder, and that's the thing. It's an ongoing
yeah.
research topic of mine because I'm going. I guess you could say I'm a hard evidentialist,
Okay.
or like in that sense. Like I wanna see if there is any form of actual in human history correspondence, even though you have this flowery,
Yeah.
fantastical
Yeah.
language that you see in the ancient Near East. And
Yeah.
Awesome, guys. Well, we both appreciate you guys coming on. That was fantastic.
Thank
Check
you.
out
Thank you for having us.
Sentinel Apologetics and Digital Hammurabi. By the way, when is the special episode coming out?
On Sitchin?
Yeah.
Is it?
We need to finish the book first.
Yeah.
I love you guys for doing that, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I got to read it. I mean, I started to look at that cylinder seal impression that it seems to be cited.
The cylinder seal is weird.
Yeah, like
Not
with
that I said that.
with the star and the dots around it or something. I mean,
Yeah.
like,
yeah, the 12 planets in the cylinder seal.
Yeah.
It's so stupid.
I mean, I was almost
ready.
We have somebody coming on for that, don't we?
Oh, it was,
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
You know how he translates Nephilim?
huh?
Those with the rocket ships that descend or something like that. Like he,
Yeah, he's out there.
something
He's,
either the sons of God or the Nephilim, like one of the two. That's what he says. Ultimately, that's what
that's
it means.
one usage. I think that shows up in Leviticus somewhere. But I mean, like, that's a rare usage. The spaceship one.
we're trying like crazy to get Graham Hancock on here. That's my dream guest right there.
I thought that, you know what I was going to say? I thought they translated it as Evan Phillips, the Nephilim, but only a handful of people might get that joke, so I'll leave it at that. But the ones who get the joke, left them free, Evan Phillips, laugh. The rest, don't worry about it.
All right.
There'll be a few
Great.
people that get that.
Fantastic. Well,
We
once
gotta
again,
have
guys,
some jokes to ourselves, do we not?
yeah,
Nope.
look, Steve.
No.
Steve, you dropped it.
I'm just here for the looks.
You
That's it.
dropped it. It worked.
All these beautiful people with product in their hair,
Just
and I'm just
step
here
away
for
from the
looks.
joke, Steve. Step away from the joke. Sometimes it's just better to.
One person will find it funny. Trust me.
Right. Yeah. All right. I think we
Well-
are going to do an after show on Steve's channel following this. So if you want to continue the conversation, come along with us. Be about 15 minutes. We'll take a break, and then we'll be back here on Sunday at 8:00, taking off tomorrow. Actually, join me tomorrow on Godless Cranium's channel. I'll be co-hosting. We're having a debate on should prostitution be legal. So there we go.
Topic.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. But anyway,
That's
thank you guys for watching.
Eastern too, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we'll see you guys on Sunday.
Good night, all.